Welcome to a new 1v1 here on the Soccer Down Here Network. My name is Jason Longshore and joined by an old friend, but a conversation that we've had a little bit offline and we haven't had it on the network. And I think it's a good time to do it with analytics in soccer becoming more and more common. XG is easily accessible through the MLS website now, for example. It's getting thrown around on game broadcasts. But what is it? What are some of the other things you can use to measure a game through analytics, through numbers? There was nobody else I knew that would be better to explain this to me and everybody else than Howard Hamilton. You know him as Soccer Metrics on Twitter. Howard, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jason. It's great to talk to you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a crazy year plus in trying to navigate everything going on, and it's good we can catch up at least virtually here. We'll get you out to an event here at some point when we start doing more of those again and popping people on. Get you to a brewery tour here because I think this is something that's going to get people interested as we talk about, from a very broad perspective. I'm looking at this basically as soccer analytics 101, because I'll be honest, it's not something that is in my expertise. I mean, I know some of the different measures. I do use statistics, but more from a, like a productivity standpoint when I'm analyzing players and I'm looking at guys who could be coming to Atlanta United, for example, or scouting opponents. But there's so much more out there. I think to start with, explain a little bit of your background and how you've been really at the forefront of analytics in soccer for a number of years.
Okay. Well, I've always been interested in numbers. I was that math nerd in high school who really caught on to math and science, did very, very well in those things. But I also liked sports. I liked writing about sports. I gravitated towards soccer in the 90s. I had some participation on a number of listservs that turned out to be very groundbreaking in North American soccer. That's where I met you. Um, I had some websites or blogs, actually, before they were even called blogs, on North American soccer. Um, During this time, I was pursuing my education. I'm a Georgia Tech alum. I got my bachelor's in aerospace engineering. I received my master's and PhD in the same thing from Stanford University. Um, and so worked as a researcher in the aerospace field for a number of places that you've heard of, from the Air Force to defense and space. But I was at a point in my career where I wanted to do something else. And around 2010, 2011, or even back up a little bit before that, 2009, 2010, there was greater interest in applying data to understanding sports, and not just understanding sports, but also informing decision making in sports. Moneyball had come out a few years before. There was more awareness of the use of data in sports, or the potential of data in sports. And that inspired some questions in my mind of how to apply analytics, how to apply a quantitative view to on-field, off-field questions within the game. I felt I was very well positioned to answer those because of my background in engineering and mathematics, combined with my sports interest. I thought that soccer was the last big frontier because traditionally it's a sport that doesn't have a lot of statistics associated with it. But I I had tossed some questions in my head, and I felt that my site was the best was the best venue to examine those questions. So I started examining those questions on my site, quickly realized I wasn't the right place for it, and so I started a new site called Soccer Metrics, and that became very popular very quickly. I then realized that there were a lot of people who were asking themselves the same questions. Then found out that there were data companies around that had been compiling data within the game for a number of years. And then things snowballed from there. I formed a company from it. I left my career in aerospace and um, pursued a full-time career with Soccer Metrics. That was a really fun 2 to 3 years. Um, I think it turned out that I was extremely early in the soccer analytics revolution, evolution, however you choose to define it. But I think I was very early in the thinking of um, applying mathematics and statistics and data to understanding and examining questions within the sport in a systematic, quantitative way.
Yeah, I really get that sense that you were ahead of the curve on this because, I mean, even now, it's not something that every club really pays, the closest of attention to on a regular basis. Um, More are, and I think it's becoming more also from a journalism, from a broadcast perspective, in a way to explain the game. It's becoming more common. But you were kind of, again, ahead of this. What what's been fascinating to me is kind of how quickly things are becoming accepted for your average fan to understand the
Yeah,
game.
yeah, it really is amazing. I think when I was getting started in when I was getting started with Psychometrics, when I was pitching my idea, not necessarily to investors, but to sports teams, to football clubs, particularly in Europe. Um, I didn't have a lot of difficulty with teams saying that what I was doing wasn't important. They just weren't willing to pay for it. They didn't see the need to invest resources in it. A lot of what um, a lot of what passed for advanced analysis in soccer, especially professional soccer, was hiring a quantitative analyst or a video analyst. And I'm not knocking video analysts; they do a lot of very important work. But they're the first to tell you that they're not data scientists. They're not numbers people. So the problem with data scientists is that it costs a lot of money for a data science. It costs a lot of money, costs a lot of time for a data scientist to acquire the skills required to, you know, to do really good work. And as a result, they command a much higher salary than traditional football clubs are willing to pay. So when I got started, um, people thought what I was doing was very important. They just weren't willing to pay for it.
Right.
Fast forward now, um, I think there are at least 20 or 30 football clubs in Europe. That sounds like a small number, but it's rapidly increasing.
Yeah.
20, 30 football clubs in Europe that have hired data scientists on their staff. And they aren't pushing them to the side or keeping them sequestered in the background. These are men, women um, who have significant responsibilities within the football club, either on the research side or on the player recruitment side. That's really significant. You see on this side of the Atlantic with Major League Soccer, um, just about every Major League Soccer team has a performance analyst or data scientist. Even down South America, you see a number of clubs, particularly in Brazil, but you see a few in Argentina and some other countries that have hired data scientists on staff, and in Mexico as well. So I think there has been a significant amount of awareness of the potential of data in soccer. And I think clubs are becoming a lot more willing to pay market value for talent, and not just on the player side, of course, but also on the front office, back office side.
Yeah, I think clubs are starting to realize that, every edge they can find over their competitors can result in winning trophies, winning more competitions, bringing in more money, more revenue. There's so many different aspects to it, and I think one of the ways, and I mean, we could go so many different directions, and what I'd love for people out there listening to this to follow up on would be, shoot me a message, shoot a reply to at soccer down here on Twitter, and let us know what questions you have in this space, because it's rapidly changing, it's rapidly evolving, and I think Howard understands the background of it far better than I do and better than most people. But let's start with XG, because it's the most common, and now, I mean, it's getting thrown up on an ESPN broadcast, on a Fox broadcast, to explain how teams have played. How did XG come about? And I know there's different models of it. Um, how accurate do you think it is?
That's a really good question. I think that's a complicated question as to its accuracy. I think it's best to explain what it is. XG, or expected goals, is a statistical model. So we take data, we assume that there is a structure of relationships between the data and some result that we're interested in, some outcome that we're interested in, and we apply that data to the structure in order to come up with something that allows us to either explain how the data is related to the outcome or predict the outcome itself. So that's a little high level. So to bring it down to the specific problem of goals, what an expected goals model is doing is that it's answering the question, given a collection of parameters that describe a shot towards goal, for instance, what is the probability that a goal is scored from that shot? Um, so, so the important thing is that we have some parameters that describe the shot towards goal. There are, as you mentioned, there are a lot of people who have their own flavors of expected goals models. There's some variance in the type of models that are out there, but I think if you look at all of those models, what they all have in common is that among the parameters that describe a shot towards goal, you have, say, distance of the shot relative to the goal, and let's define, say, a point like at the center of the goal, line. The angle of the shot relative to the goal.
Okay.
Say, if you're straight on, that's, say, a 0-degree angle, all the way to, say, as extreme as, a corner flag position at a 90-degree angle. The type of play, whether the play happened in open play, whether it resulted from a set piece or was a penalty, and we're disregarding own goals in this formulation. The body type, so where is the foot, the head, some other body part, and no, hands don't count.
Poor Diego.
Yeah, for Diego. And so those are the four major types of parameters that describe the shot towards goal. There are other parameters that are there are other parameters that tend to be incorporated in expected goals model. One that you wouldn't really think would be applicable is match state, like the score differential at the time that a shot was taken. Most people would not think that the probability of scoring a goal depends on the match state, but if you look at the data and you examine the relationship between match state and the probability of a shot conversion, the effect is actually quite significant. So that tends to be included. Match time is included. It's normal. It's usually on a normalized scale, but match time is included. There are some models that account for a specific competition. So the assumption there is that the conversion rate, the overall conversion rate changes from competition to competition, or certain types of plays are more likely to occur in certain competitions or at certain levels of competition than others. I tend not to do that because one, there isn't a lot that restricts the amount of data you can use, and that becomes very important for reasons I'll explain later. And two, if you examine shot conversion rates between competitions, the conversion rate remains quite stable, around 9 to 10%. It may be a little bit higher for some leagues. It may be a little bit lower for some leagues. It may be a little bit lower at say a second division level or third division level, so forth. But between 9 to 11% is tends to be the conversion rate at which shots are converted to goals in soccer.
Okay, so couple questions. Let me stick with one first on kind of how the model is structured. So one thing that is complicated when we're watching a game and an XG number is flashed on the screen, we might not really know what their model is to define their expected goal calculation, correct?
Right. We may not know all the parameters that go into it. I would say that at a minimum, distance, angle, the type of play, and the body type are considered in the expected goals models that you tend to see.
Right. So like you could see the same game and some variation between the XG number for a team or for both teams just because of the differences in modeling. I've
Not
noticed
just
that.
the difference in the model, but also the difference in the data that's used to incorporate it.
Good point.
Because I had the opportunity to teach data analytics to college students earlier this year. And one of the things I emphasized to them was if the patterns that you are trying to capture are not present in your data, they won't be present in your model either. So a statistical model, or really any type of model that tries to describe some incomplete view of the world, is only as good as the data that is used to train it, the data that is incorporated into it. So for most of these expected goals models, you don't really you need a lot of shot data in
Mhm.
order to properly identify the patterns of play or the patterns of shot making and shot conversion that occur in a typical football match. And that usually translates to about 3 or 4 seasons of data
Okay.
um, for either for a specific competition or for multiple competitions. And the expected goals models that I have built, I've incorporated data from multiple competitions because I didn't have enough data from a single competition um, to make statistically reliable estimates uh, what, with a resulting model. So I had to use um, data from multiple competitions. That's not necessarily a bad thing because you incorporate those little variations of patterns of shot making, shot conversion into your model, and in the end, you know, you get you get a more reliable model. Um, yeah, um, I would imagine that the models that you see on television now are incorporating data that go back at least 5 seasons or more, um,
Yeah.
and not just in one league, but in multiple leagues. So we're talking about tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of shots that are incorporated into a single XG model.
Now, one thing that is not incorporated into it, which I would assume would probably be impossible to really calculate, although who knows, um, if a player's under pressure. So, like, I know there's different things to kind of account for the difficulty of the shot, but a shot from 10 yards to the from the right post, if you're looking at the goal facing it, from equal with the or level with the right post, so a little bit of an angle, 10 yards away. As a player, if you're unmarked there, it's an easier shot than if you are marked, if you are under pressure. But that's not accounted for in an XG model, correct?
It really depends on the type of data you have access to.
Okay.
Um, you know, when I was getting started in soccer analytics, most of the data was coming from a company called Opta.
Right.
I think we're all familiar with that. There's part of Stat Sports now. Um, the data coming from Opta was what was called technical tactical data, or
Yeah.
player positional data. Well, not player positional data. It was event data. So every discrete event within a match uh, was being was being described. So it
Okay.
was parameterized by time, location, and then you had some characteristics of the match event. Um, Player pressure was not one of those events. It was very hard to capture.
Yeah.
Now there were companies, I think StatDNA was an early pioneer in this. They're now part of Arsenal Football Club. They quantified the amount of pressure that a player had, or they quantified the distance between a player and the closest defender or the closest opposing player.
Yeah.
If you have that information, and if you have tracking data such as Prozone or Stats or SciSports or some other vendors, um, if you have tracking data, you can you can capture the distance between a player of interest and the closest opposing player, and then get an idea of whether that player was closely marked or free.
Mhm.
The problem is that that data is very recent. So if you are tasked with building an expected goals model and you are incorporating data into that model, you may not necessarily have enough data that includes marking distance. So it's a very good thing to have. I think you're exactly right. Knowing whether or not a player was free or closely marked or something in between, I think impacts shot conversion rate. I think that's common sense to all of us who observe the sport.
Sure.
That information is not necessarily available, and until recently, it hasn't been available.
That makes sense. And it's something that I think we're seeing, I mean, just from my background in it, and I'm learning more about it seemingly every day, it feels like, because it's just more common to find these numbers now, where before I didn't have access to it. Now I do. Now there's so many different numbers out there. Are there certain metrics that you see that you believe in? Like, what do you go to when you look up information about a match and you want to get the sense of how the match played out? You didn't see the match. You're looking at the numbers to kind of get your intro to this match. What are the things you look for? Like, is it expected assists, XA? Is there something else? Like, what are you looking at that gives you the clearest picture of how a match played out?
Before I answer that question, I think one last thing I want to point out about expected goals and about all of these expected metrics is that they express a probability by an average team with an average conversion rate, right? In the case of expected goals,
Okay.
it communicates the probability that a goal will be scored by an average team with an average conversion rate. Now, an average team could be an average Bundesliga team or an average first division team. You know, a player, obviously there are players who have, higher conversion rates, Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi or Joseph Martinez, for example. And there are some players who may have somewhat worse conversion rates. So, what we're seeing with expected goals is that given the types of shots that a team have, given the types of actions that team made, what is the probability that those shots would be converted by an average team with average shot conversion ability? And then you have something to compare against when you're examining a specific team. So now to answer your question about which metrics I go to, I don't go to a specific metric per se. I do look at expected goals. I do look at expected assists. And expected assists is given the collection of parameters that describe a pass, was the probability that a goal resulted from that pass or that a goal resulted immediately following that pass. I expected assists can tell some of the story, but can be incomplete.
Yeah.
Same with expected goals, it can tell part of the story, but it can be incomplete. If you look at the total expected goals, for some matches it could tell the entire story, and for other matches it could be incomplete. So sometimes it's useful to look at how how expected goals rose or fell over the course of a match. So you can either visualize them, in terms of, say, in terms of a step plot. So So you know, you're applying the two team shots over the course of the match, and you're observing how the total number of expected goals um, changed over the course of the match. Or you can look at the say local differentials in expected goals over the course of a match. And I've created some graphics that illustrate these. So you kind of see some idea, you kind of get some imperfect view of match flow, really. So which team generated more xG over some period of time than others, than the opposing team. How did that vary over the match? Did a team appear to be on its heels toward the end, or was soaking up pressure? Because sometimes you may have a situation where a team has less xG, or a team has generated less xG than its opponent. They may win a match 1-0 or 2-1. But if you look at how the expected goal differential changed over the match, you start to realize, hey, maybe that opposing team, or maybe that team that was in the lead, was sitting back and absorbing pressure for, say, the last quarter of the match, and the other team had all the advantage in terms of play, shots on goal. They were attempting to score an equalizer. That's why their xG rose to a point where they had larger they had a larger amount than the opponent, even though they lost the match. So it's I think all of these metrics provide an imperfect view of what's going on. And sometimes what I do is I look at those advanced metrics, and then if I'm not able to watch the game, I read the press report. I read
Yeah.
the press report to see, okay, this if if this reporter is observing that the other team enjoyed most of the opportunities but couldn't convert, or some goalkeeper standing on his head, or that this one player is really influential, and the xG or xj numbers really bear that out. Then in that case, those advanced metrics are seeing something real. But I, I I know not everyone in analytics approaches the match the way that I do, but the way I do is, I look at the advanced numbers, and then I look at how people from outside of the analytics community viewed the match, whether in the press report or in a televised broadcast.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, that's kind of me in reverse when I look at it, because I think the most important thing to realize for people who are hearing some of these terms and getting to know XG and other stuff is that it is imperfect. It's not, you know, this game I think is the hardest one to encapsulate with sheer numbers alone. I think there's things that are hard to quantify. And, I'll watch a game and I'll have a feel of a game, and whether I feel like one team controlled it more than the other, one team had better chances, or game state, like you mentioned, which I think is incredibly critical. A team might have a lower XG for the match, but they might have scored 2 goals in the first 30 minutes and then sat back and were comfortable and conceded a goal and conceded a bunch of chances because they were conceding control of the match. They took control in a different way by defending. It's hard to do it purely one or the other. It feels like there does need to be a bit of a tandem approach of watching a game, watching a player, if you're evaluating a player, and combining that with the data to get the clearest picture of a game or a player or a team. It does take a little bit of both, and it seems like the teams that are now investing in data analysis and do that helps them be more well-rounded rather than purely relying on that and not listening to their scouts, for example, who might go and watch a game and notice a player. The numbers can help justify further involvement in recruiting that player, or can say, well, maybe there's a little more to this. Maybe you need to watch again. Maybe you caught him on a good day, for example, that kind of stuff.
That's exactly right. I think at the beginning, I know when I got started with soccer analytics, that there was a scouts versus quants. There was a scouts versus quants kind of beef. But I think people have realized that for most case, for most case, the quants aren't trying to take scouts' jobs or throw them out of work. The two worlds really do need each other. And I think where analytics helps in the player recruitment process is that it acts as an initial filter. So instead of considering, say, a couple hundred players if you're a mid-tier team, or 20 players, if 20 or 30 players, if you were, say, a top club. Now, thanks to analytics, you might be considering four or five past the cut, for say a major club, or maybe 10 or 15 for a mid-level club, or a club that has fewer resources. And then you can go out and scout those players. You can go out and send your scouts to examine those players. Do they pass the eye test? Do they satisfy some other criteria that are important to the club? I
Watch
think
how they
that's
train like that,
right.
like to get a fuller picture.
Right. I think from the perspective of the media, I think um, where XG is really valuable is in setting the narrative, or establishing narratives, because you can, not just in the total XG, but also understanding how XG for the two opponents evolved over the course of the football match, how the differences in XG evolved. And you can construct a narrative of match flow, which team had the advantage, which team dominated in opportunities and things like that. So you are providing some quantitative structure to comments that either your studio analysts are making or the managers themselves are making. One example that I always find humorous, I think it was one that was mentioned when I went to a Sloan conference several years ago. I believe it was Tim Sherwood was commenting about expected goals and these advanced metrics, and he thought that they were totally useless. He didn't feel that there was any value to them. And then I think after one match, he was complaining about how it was so unfair that his team lost the match when they enjoyed the majority of the really good chances. He said we dominated play, and we had the best chances to score in this game. And in that one sentence, he was quantifying what expected goals does for you. It looking at the considering the types of shots that are taken in the game, quantifying the probability that those shots be converted into goals, so that the total expected goals over the match were the expected goals scored by an average team of average shot conversion ability if they had those chances themselves. He was expressing the same thing that proponents of expected goals, have been trying to say, and he wasn't aware of it. So I always think of that example when I think of the utility of expected goals. I think it really, it's useful. It's useful for football clubs. I think it's even more useful for the media because it allows them to develop narratives of how a match evolved and which teams were really on top.
It makes total sense, and it definitely helps me as I'm getting to know a team when I start my scouting process to call a game. It gives me a baseline to look at, and it gives me a starting point, and you start to, yeah, kind of create that narrative in your head and think about, all right, this is something I want to dig deeper into. Why is this player resulting in such a high XG but not scoring many goals? Why do they have a bunch of goals and they have a low XG? You can start to then have a point to attack in your research and your analysis. This, I think, is, I hope, really helpful for people listening to have a more broad picture of XG. And as I said before, if you're out there listening and you have questions, because I'd like to make this a little bit of a semi-regular series, because I have a gut feeling, Howard. I want to end with you on this. I have a gut feeling that XG is just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of your average fan, media, what have you, to start talking about. It feels like there will be more analytics coming to the mainstream in soccer. And, is there something that you have seen? Is there something that you are seeing start to emerge that you think will be the next mainstream analytics number or definition that comes to the fore?
I would say I would say there are two categories of analytics that I believe could become more popular or important in soccer over the next few years. I think the first one is pitch control, um, and you know, pitch control is a little complicated. Is a lot more complicated than expected goals. It's the one. It's one metric that incorporates tracking data. So the type of data that is incorporated into this model is a lot more complicated. But what a pitch control model does is that um, it incorporates the off the ball movement of players and examining positive places on the pitch for players to move to. That gives his team an advantage.
Okay.
So there are places where a player can move on a team that increases the probability that that their possession ends in either a shot on goal or goal itself. Um, I think that will take some effort to make accessible to general public, but
Yeah.
I've seen animations of pitch control models, and it's just so cool to see how these how these colors that communicate goal probability changes as certain players move into certain areas. And you also see which players are really really good at pulling opposing players away from certain areas and opening spaces up for their teammates. I would say a second type of metric. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to be kind of broad in this. Would be defensive metrics.
I was gonna ask.
I think there's one metric that I heard about called expected tackles. Um, I don't know a lot about that. It's called. I'm guessing that's what XT stands for. Um, given some collection parameters that describe, I don't even know what some type of action occurs on the field. What's the probability that a successful tackle is made? I'm really intrigued by that. I think I'm intrigued by any type of advanced defensive metrics because those are so much more difficult to make than offensive metrics. It's real easy to make metrics um, that describe the probability of a goal being scored, the probability of an assist being made, or the probability of a pass being converted. But it's really difficult to quantify defensive actions if you don't have knowledge of the off the ball movement of the players. When I got started, we really didn't have that, or it it was accessible to very few people. It's still not accessible to the general public, but tracking data is available to a lot more people than before. And in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of really great research, quantifying goal probability, you know, quantifying play outcome across all areas of the pitch, including the defensive half. So I'm really intrigued to see what develops in terms of defensive metrics in the coming years.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's kind of the missing element, I think, is as that becomes more fully fleshed out. I think we'll get a better picture from the numbers of how players play and how games play out and how teams play. It's going to be fun to explore this. You guys out there listening, you have questions, send them our way. I'm going to compile some questions. I'm probably going to have some that come up myself as some of these numbers become more common. I need to dig into XT. I really like that idea. I'm curious to see how that would come together. But Howard, I really appreciate your time. I think this is really helpful to a lot of people with the stuff just becoming mainstream now, without maybe the explanation of why it's mainstream and why it's important. You've really covered a lot of that ground, and I really appreciate it. I hope the listeners really appreciate it as well.
Great. I hope what I said was useful.
We will see. It helps me. I know that, and it'll help me prepare for upcoming games as I dig into numbers. So I appreciate it, and let us know what you think out there listening. Shoot us a message on Twitter at Soccer Down Here, and we will be catching up with Howard on future episodes for sure. And we will, Howard, you and I will grab a beer here very soon as well.
Yes. Well, dinner too, and I'll pick up the check as
All
well.
right, take that. I will take that. That will be very nice. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody. I will be back with another Soccer Down Here 1v1 very soon.